Pleasant good day to one and all, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this second installment of the SALISES Virtual Forum, following the first forum that was held just over 2 weeks ago dealing with the national budget. This morning, today, we examine another critical issue that has emerged in the context of COVID-19, and this has to do with the management of the national education system in Trinidad and Tobago. Special welcome to our presenters, and thank you in advance for making the time and effort to be part of this important discussion this morning that has been going on since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. I now want to hand you over to our Acting Director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, to give his opening remarks. Dr. St. Bernard.
Thank you, Dr. McLean, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to our esteemed presenters, my SALISES colleagues, UE colleagues, and everyone who is in the virtual space witnessing this event this morning. I bring warm UWI and SALISES greetings to all of you, and I particularly welcome each and every one of you to this event. It is a special event and one of the many events that SALISES intends to convene during the next academic year. And as the chair said, this particular event deals with managing the national education system. But before I get into the details about this particular session, I want to express my sincerest thanks on behalf of the university and SALISES, first of all, to all of those who made the inaugural virtual SALISES conference a success. The success it was. I want in particular to thank the presenters, Dr. Mohan from SALISES, Professor Carl Theodore, Dr. Taimba Salandi, Dr. Selvon Hazel, Ms. Suniti Maharaj, and Mr. Melka Sanatan. They delivered their insights expertly, and from all accounts, it was a successful affair. I also want to thank all the UWI staff, including those in SALISES, and of course, the virtual audience who made that session the success it was. Today, I look forward to another successful engagement. And I want to first express my pleasure and my profound thanks to the panelists who responded willingly to our invitation to participate in this meeting. I want to say a few quick things about the theme, because I feel strongly, and we at SALISES and in the university feel strongly, that education is a critical pillar in development process. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we are experiencing the challenges that face the education system in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the whole idea of the pandemic and the lessons to be learned, I think it is a critical agenda as we chart a progressive future for our young children. And as I think about what we are about to do here today, I have been minded by a number of colleagues that perhaps, this session that we have here today, while it will be important, will not perhaps be fully exhaustive to deal with the issues. So already we are contemplating a second iteration of this particular theme that will address further issues and engage a number of other panelists who will speak to us and present from their particular vantage points. So we are really happy to have this esteemed team here with us today, and we look forward to a really engaging encounter, an exchange of ideas and presentation of insights from both sides of the fence, the presenters on one hand, the panelists on one hand, and of course, the virtual audience. So in closing off, I would like to say that, SALISES is always pleased to be part of these kinds of arrangements. SALISES is a 3-campus organ of development studies specialists. And I have heard some people referring to SALISES as the best kept secret. We have to change that notion of SALISES. It's no longer a secret. And of course, we are about retaining the best, and even better yet, bettering best. So here we are today, convening this meeting, this engagement, this encounter. And I want to thank everyone for their participation and willingness to make the time to be here today. And we look forward to a successful forum. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you will enjoy the treat that we have prepared for everyone who will be participating in this event. Have a good day, everyone, and do enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. And just let me state that I am Roy McCrae. I am the chair for this morning's discussion. We have already called a roll this morning, and everybody is present here today. So you have 10 minutes to make your presentation, as was said before, and I will give you a 2-minute warning before your time is up. Our first presenter is Mr. Kevin David, who is the president of Port of Spain and Environs, or the Lighthouse region of the National Parent Teachers Association, and a former public relations officer of the NPTA executive. He is a graduate of the University of Hertfordshire and a system analysis by profession, specializing in cybersecurity. I now invite Mr. Kevin David to make his presentation, giving us particularly a parental perspective on the present COVID-19 related educational challenges. Mr. David? You may begin.
To the Chair, Dr. Roy McCrae, Acting Director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, the Secretary of Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, Ms. Katia Modest, staff and students of Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, staff and students of the University of the West Indies, fellow presenters, our viewing audience, good morning. On behalf of the National Council of Parent Teacher Association, our interim president, Mrs. Zina Ramatali, I am Kevin David and present to you this morning the COVID-19 pandemic, lessons learned, and charting progressive education agendas from the parents' perspective. As harsh and difficult for one to consume, it cannot be denied that Charles Darwin's provoking thoughts still resonates with us today. As great or challenging a year could be, 2019 was like any other year for us, As parents, we face the daily challenges of preparing and ensuring the health and safety and education of our children. The closer the ending of the year drew, the topic of Christmas was on everyone's mind, with the one exception. There were new buzzwords. Novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. This fueled many conversations as it was raised in many of our PTA meetings, very gingerly though. In review, it was never thought we may have been affected. And if though, it certainly would not be that serious. Yes, the ideology of God being a Trinity was mentioned. However, it was more than that. It was the belief in modern day medicine. It was expected that proper controls were to be instituted, impeding the spread of this virus and containing it to that side of the world. As all great things begin with a new year, 2019 broke and 2020 entered. 2020 was embraced with great expectations. Even from an institutional perspective, the PTA was about to change its leaves. The expected growth of the organization to produce new ideas, new programs, and certainly to provide our membership more support was certainly on the agenda. While we attempted to move forward, the discussions of this virus grew. This time, when this virus landed as a point for discussion on our meeting's agenda, it was clear we were concerned. While things worsened on the other side of the world, our side of the world began to show symptoms. The uncertainty of how this virus was being transmitted drew many speculations. The constant bombardment of the foreign media houses of the rise in cases affected many of us mentally. However, for the time, life did continue. Then, the first case was found in Trinidad. This mounted our fears. And by March 13, 2020, as president of the Polar Spain Environs Regional PTA, I had to address the membership. In this address, all guidelines were set out by the ministry was stated. One of the points that was raised was that the PTA had no power to close any school. This was something parents pondered. We provided information consisting of research papers from the World Health Organization and guidelines from the Ministry of Health, which was distributed to our parents. The same thing was done for other regions. Phase 1. It was at this time the formation of community of practice was formed with PTA, other NGOs, and government. We did provide hampers and many situations cook food for parents. It must be stated in review, there was never a major concern with reference to our children being home. The concern was food. Within phase 2, the donations and the ability to create hampers began to diminish. Within a couple of weeks, what did not decline were the cries for help. It was at this point the community that formed began to weaken. The enthusiasm that was there at the beginning began to fade. The mental strength that upheld and kept focus was being challenged. It was at this point many broke. Fortunately, at the phase 3 level, at this junction, the government began to provide financial support. It was at this point many had to seek assistance for themselves as they too became in need, as no one expected this period to extend well into this new year. It was at this stage a level of stillness cut across the mayhem and uncertainty. It was like the human species was being transformed and adapting to its new environment. However, the stillness did not last for too long. COVID-19 was not only here, but was taking lives. At our stage 4, the discussion on online school was brought forth. Within a short time, the educational system was transformed from going to school to parents searching for devices to provide for communication. The PTA also played their part. Many schools were unable to reach their parents. With the assistance of the PTA, the entire educational system changed. It was at this junction that we all had to work together to ensure this worked. However, due to loss of income and difficulties in getting computer shops open, Many parents had to collect packages while others had to use their phones. This created many new issues. Life doesn't get easier or more forgiving. We get stronger and more resilient. Lessons learned. Mental health. Firstly, I must admit in review, the mental trauma associated with COVID-19 certainly impacted everyone. There are some things I did not recall only upon preparation of this presentation today. The ability for the human being at times to remain or be resilient comes from it with holding the memories of it all. For the parents, the sudden impact of the effects associated with COVID-19 created more mental stress than if it was done gradually. For example, the loss of someone, then losing a job probably a year later. For the children, the lack of socialization would have affected many. In addition, many of our children did not live in what we define as perfect situations. School provided that avenue to have themselves removed from that environment. This is where children felt that they were part of something greater. In addition, having parents and guardians fulfill the role of teacher also played on the mental health of many of our children. The inability for parents to communicate in a teachable manner will certainly affect our children. Society. The overall mental health of the nation was altered. Firstly, by acknowledging that mental health is something real. Secondly, it can affect everyone. Thirdly, we needed to support everyone. One of the most troubling things we noted as an organization was our society did not read. This became quite apparent when information was released and questions were asked. This was not only seen from our guidelines being provided, but the request for information. As a leader, I communicated my mantra. If you don't come out of this quarantine with a new skill, your side hustle started, more knowledge, you never lack time, you lack discipline. With this, we went in a drive to share websites that hosted information on a wide variety of topics. We posted in our messages wherever we got chance, just to ensure our parents and children were surrounded with nutritious source of information.
2 more minutes.
If I am asked, what would I define as the greatest impact COVID-19 had on us after loss of life is learning loss. The sudden change environment would impact those who would have had challenges. The ability for the information to be transposed into another format when presented to the child was also created issues of comprehending. The inability for children to receive the information due to not having a device or the financial or physical inability to reach a school for packages. Our special needs children would also be impacted by learning loss. This would be more challenging for them as their learning may need physical interaction to provide that support. With any survey conducted by the NPTA, analysis showed there was a great disparity also between government schools and denominational schools. The impact of learning loss will be felt across all levels, and I repeat, it will be felt across all levels. This includes both primary and secondary and tertiary level as well. How we deal with this will decide our society's trajectory. The demand for technology and the demand for its use created a shockwave throughout the world. It was found that many of our teachers were challenged with using the technological devices. Many did not have, some had no choice to use their phones. This created many barriers for communicating the syllabus to our children. What was also learned was many of the technological devices purchased were of inferior quality. Many failed and resulted in students losing time in class. The demand for many of these devices outweighed the supply and resulted in delays before it arrived to the tables of our students. One important thing, there is no other side of the world or our side of the world. Despite the distance, we share one world, one Mother Nature. Charting progressive education agendas.
You are over time now. Please wrap up.
The trajectory of our society will depend on the sources we make and the path we choose to follow. Our meetings must be meaningful and well-intended. The ideas provided by all stakeholders must be taken in consideration. We as a people must decide on the path in which our educational system must take. It must be aligned to the development and the needs of society. As parents, our roles has changed. We need to become more involved. Teachers, the role of teacher must be respected, and the provisions for curriculum enhancement must be maintained. Education. As a society, our minds need to be open to the many different ways our children can be taught. Homeschooling, although have existed for many years right here in TNT, seem to have overlooked for one apparent reason or another. Now we are seeing it becoming more and more part of the discussion. It is my view, we as a society, we need to avoid being complacent with our children's education and the growth of society. I'm Kevin David, and I say thank you once again for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you for laying the context for the discussion as we continue. Our next speaker is Ms. Antonia Tika de Freitas, first female president of the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association, who has been also in the trenches as a primary school teacher since 1987. She also has a BSc and MSc from the University of the West Indies. I now invite Ms. Tika de Freitas to make her presentation, and I ask all presenters to please keep a check of their time. You have 10 minutes and you get a 2-minute warning to wrap up.
Thank
Ms.
you
Tika de
very
Freitas?
much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning to you, to esteemed panelists, with all protocols being observed. And it is indeed an honor and a privilege to present at this SALISES Forum, an institute that has had great influence on my worldview and my approach to dealing with matters. From the perspective of the teacher, when that pandemic started and when we went into lockdown in Trinidad and Tobago in March of 2020, immediately for us, we started to look at the issue of the emergency mitigation strategies. On the one hand, we looked at strategies that would allow safety and survival before formal education. And whilst the state took the necessary measures, we as educators, primary, secondary, tertiary, ECCE, went into that pastoral aspect of what we do, preparing hampers, preparing packages, making donations, making deliveries, etc. Because the parents indicated that since the situation was so dire, they did not know how they would cope. And that situation, unfortunately, has not changed to date. And I will explain why in a moment. As educators, we became concerned, and we are still concerned about that management of the pandemic. How are we going to manage the pedagogy in this pandemic? Emergency mitigation strategies, where we put Maslow before Bloom, where we look at survival before all of the aspects of education. What we recognized was that there would need to be a transition from emergency mitigation strategies, packages, WhatsApp, email, Zoom, Google, whatever other platform, to a more sustainable and a more appropriate and systematic process for teaching and learning in Trinidad and Tobago. So the question I would want to put here for consideration during the forum and even after, from September 2020, which is when the new academic year started, to now, have we transitioned really from emergency mitigation strategies to a more long-term solution where we can see the pedagogical innovation, where we can see various initiatives and strategies to build resilience and sustainability? What we notice now, colleagues and audience, is that as the cases of COVID begin to rise in our society and it begins to impact on our upper level school students who are out and about, we have to close schools maybe for a day, 2 days to get the sanitization done, to get the contact tracing done, etc. And therefore, as educators, that kind of disruption that we are experiencing, in our view, that does not augur well for the psychological impact it will have on the students, both in terms of their curriculum delivery and their assimilation of what's in the curriculum, as well as in terms of their performance during the high stakes assessments that we put so much stock by, the CXC's examinations, as well as the SEA. So from our perspective of tutor and educators in general, what we recognize is that we have to take stock of the lessons, as was mentioned previously. What are some of the lessons we've learned? A major lesson we've learned is that the pandemic has shown how inadequate our education system is, built around that post-colonial era, how inadequate our education system is to be resilient, to be adaptable, and to be agile. And it's pretty much the same that's happened in other parts of the world and in other parts of the Caribbean. But there are some fundamental differences that I would want to highlight between what's happened and what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago and other jurisdictions. We in Trinidad and Tobago experience a number of consultations and parliamentary hearings, joint select committee hearings, etc. We spoke about the need for devices, the need for connectivity, the inequalities that existed, etc. Treatment with students with special needs, expending extra energy and focus on the technical vocational areas that would drive our recovery. And 2 budgets later, fiscal 2020-2021 and fiscal 2021 to 2022, although we have seen the education sector receive the largest allocation from the budget, we are yet to see the tangible investments in education in terms of physical, human, material, and financial resources to demonstrate a systematic long-term plan for our education at all levels in Trinidad and Tobago. We have not been research-driven enough. Collecting statistics and putting statistics out on a weekly or monthly basis, as the case may be, is not enough to demonstrate that we have done a comprehensive analysis of the impact of the pandemic on the parent, on the child, on the educator, and on the curriculum that we currently deliver, and therefore what modifications and adjustments are required. As tutor, we recognize that training is important in this particular context, in this new context. You know, people talk about the new normal, and that does not resonate with me. There's nothing normal about this scenario. It's new, but it's not normal. But we have to adapt. We have to be agile and flexible. We have to learn these strategies as educators, and we have to teach these strategies to our students and to our members of society so that we can eventually cater for all students to be able to maximize their potential. As educators, what we are saying, therefore, it can't be business as usual. If we are looking, colleagues, at the progressive agendas and charting a way forward, it cannot be considered business as usual. One of the biggest flaws we have noticed is the use of the jargon. For some of us, and I guess it's because of our experiences, and as Mr. David said, the limitations that we place by not reading, for some of us, online teaching means the same as virtual teaching, the same as remote teaching, the same as using a computer. And we recognize that there are vast differences, not only in the methodology for the different components, but also in resourcing and strategies, etc. So we would posit as educators, we are still in the emergency mitigation strategy mode, still trying to catch up because there are students who still don't have devices or still are unable to connect. We are still in a situation where our curriculum is not aligned or has not been realigned to allow us to function in the scenario. We need, therefore, to look at the models and the best practices that have been utilized in other jurisdictions. the CARICOM OECS Learning Recovery Model, for example, the model for school recovery and sustainability as proposed by Education International, among others. That's the only way, colleagues, we will build resilience in our education sector. That's the only way we will become adaptable and agile, and our teachers would now be able to function in the new environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Ms. De Freitas, for giving us that more student perspective as well as a teacher perspective, as well on our present challenges. And thank you as well for sticking to time. Our next presenter is Dr. Savira Abdul Majid. Dr. Abdul Majid is a lecturer and course coordinator of the Bachelor of Education, Early Childhood Care and Education program at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She earned her PhD also in education from the UE St. Augustine in 2009. And she also has a certificate in early childhood education from the Valsain Teachers College. I now invite Dr. Abdul Majid to make her presentation.
Thank
Dr.
you
Abdul
very
Majid,
much, Chair.
you have 10 minutes with a 2-minute warning.
All right, thank you, Chair, Dr. McCree, Acting Director, Dr. St. Bernard, fellow presenters, attendees. It is my pleasure to present on the impact of COVID-19, important lessons learned and implications for the future of education services delivery from the standpoint of early childhood care and education in Trinidad and Tobago. So without a doubt, COVID-19 has severely impacted early childhood teachers and by extension, the early childhood sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Many private early childhood centers have shut down. They have closed their doors, even though enrollment records for 3 to 4-year-old children showed that 78% of our preschool children attend private preschools, with the other 22% attending civil government-assisted Ministry of Education preschools. And this is Ministry of Education 2011 data. So my presentation will examine the context of early childhood teaching during COVID-19. It will also look at teachers' experiences and how they coped, and I would provide some recommendations going forward. So, as I said before, COVID-19 has severely impacted early childhood education, the early childhood education sector, okay? And, we have, and it can be seen as a gendered affair because it's mostly women who work in early childhood centers. The men, we can count them on our hands. And many women with early childhood degrees are now cashiers, store clerks, unemployed, or they have returned with their families. Some of them have told me to live with their parents. Some private preschool manage to finance themselves, and they are continuing to operate virtually. But what of teachers' experiences? If we look across the board, government early childhood centers, we have government-assisted centers, and we have schools, preschools attached to institutions, as well as the private schools. So what of the quality of teaching and learning that is currently taking place? What do teachers say about their experiences during COVID-19 pandemic? The expert, Fullon, 1996, he explained that it is the teacher on the front line implementing policies who best understand the challenges of continuing education during times of emergencies. So I'll be looking at teachers' experiences, the support they said they needed and what they actually received, which impacted their well-being and also the quality of teaching during the pandemic and beyond. Even though early childhood spans from birth to 8 years old, my focus is on the teachers of 3 to 4-year-old children. And I'm referencing data from research done with my colleague at UWI School of Education, Fulbright scholar Sandra Figaro Henry, as well as conversations with early childhood educators. The health protocols implemented worldwide due to the pandemic led to emergency remote teaching for young children in Trinidad and Tobago. And this is worldwide. This temporary teaching approach in a crisis differs from effective distance or online teaching, which takes about 6 to 9 months of planning, using a systematic instructional design model. So against this backdrop of emergency remote teaching, which we have been experiencing from the start of the pandemic, in some situations people have transitioned, but in some situations it remains that. What are some important lessons learned? Well, and teachers overwhelmingly said that they experienced emotional stressors. Okay, so this diagram here is showing what teachers experienced and how they cope. And in the middle there, that is supposed to represent the emotional stressors that teachers basically, as you go through what they were saying, it was laden with that. They had difficulty confronting change. This is at the top here. They switched from face-to-face to virtual emergency remote teaching in quick time without the skill set. One teacher spoke about crying herself to sleep at night because her audio had failed during a lesson. Of course, she improved over time with crash courses and help from other members of staff and family. But the initial trauma was terrifying for many teachers. Emotional stress also resulted from pedagogical challenges. Okay, just to teach to get the message across virtually. Early childhood education is a specialist field requiring lots of manipulators for hands-on learning. Many people don't think about this. They just think it's a level within the system, but it's very specific. How do you get resources when you're at home and everything is on lockdown at school? Well, some teachers innovated. They used their children's toys, made videos doing exercises in their garage with their family, or they encouraged children to count leaves in the backyard. Also, in a new paradigm, teachers need a responsible adult at home to guide young children's learning. They have to teach parents how to assist a child to develop, for example, writing skills. It sometimes arises too where a parent would not turn on the camera to share the child's work because home sweet home is not exactly a showpiece HGTV setting. Sometimes parents explain that they couldn't be with their children at the specific times because they had to work. Some schools responded by becoming more flexible. Others were more rigid, okay? And they stuck to the timetables and so on that they had prior to in the face-to-face mode. Other systems, that were more tightly managed, they didn't deviate from the timetable. And in those instances, teachers worried as they thought about the disadvantage and in terms of learning time lost for the children. Further challenging situations included families without computer or data access, illiterate parents who cannot help their children, dysfunctional families, children with special needs. Often older children in families with multiple children, the older ones are prioritized to use the devices, and the younger ones, they don't attend school or they have limited access. Sometimes teachers said that they bought data for children in order for them to learn. So they'll buy data for their phone so that the children could get some kind of access to schooling. So there were also technological challenges. Okay, teachers had to upskill really fast. They got help from their children at the UWI Children's Center, where it's a more privileged environment. Universities, the teachers had access to the university's information technology department. We also got assistance of Dr. Semper Scott, who lives abroad and wanted to give back to her country. She worked as a consultant with the school. However, even in situations that are more privileged, there was a lot that teachers had to do for themselves. They had to learn how to use Zoom or produce and upload videos to YouTube. Then they had to redo these videos if they got shut down for copyright infringement and so on.
2 more minutes.
So teachers spoke about this increased workload, okay, which they dealt with through creativity and collaboration. So we can see that teachers they were very resilient and resourceful, okay? And you know, it is good to talk about not just the physical resources that they would have need, but the mental trauma and the stress that they would have experiencing. And when I'm referencing Simone Biles here, because we are in a time when we have these big megastars talking about mental issues and how, you know, things like stress can affect your performance and what you're able to do. And this is true for teachers here during the pandemic as well. So recommendations, teachers need to be retooled and reskilled. And we have one researcher saying that we cannot have analog teachers in a digital age. Teachers must meet children's educational requirements and remain, constant across the settings. Whether you're in face-to-face or you are in a virtual setting, you still have to meet some standard of teaching. We need to prepare for education in future emergencies. We may have hurricanes, earthquakes, or whatever. So, you know, let this be a wake-up call for us that we need to put systems in place. We need to fix pre-pandemic problems. We have early childhood that is not within the legal education system. That needs to be fixed in order for teachers' terms and conditions of employment to be more in line with primary and secondary school. And we need to plan based on research. You know, we need to develop policies and plans that are grounded in research. And finally, we need to do more to ready parents for online teaching and learning. So even though a positive is that parents and families are now more involved in children's education, we should consider the complexity and diversity of families as well. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Majid, for dealing with a sector which I haven't heard much of in the context of COVID-19. The discussion has tended to be dominated by the primary school and the educational secondary schools. I stand corrected, but thanks for that important contribution. Our next speaker is Dr. Fiona Rajkumar. Dr. Rajkumar is an associate professor of history at the University of the Southern Caribbean. She also has a BA and MA in history as well from the University of the West Indies. Dr. Rajkumar, I think, is going to focus particularly on homeschooling. I now invite her to make a presentation. Dr. Rajkumar.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCree. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So this morning, I'm going to look at the homeschooling perspective. There's a lot that I can say, but in the interest of time and wanting to keep within the 10 minutes, there are some areas I will focus on. So I will look at defining and highlighting some of the characteristics of homeschooling, outlining some of the challenges faced by selected homeschooling parents during the COVID-19 pandemic, examine some of the adjustment strategies employed by homeschooling families during the pandemic, and then to see what are some of the things that we can glean or the ideas that we can glean from the homeschooling experience to chart progressive agendas for the education system moving forward. Well, just to declare my own positionality, I am also a homeschooling parent of 2 girls. One is 13 and the other will be 9 in January. And so this also comes from personal experience as well. And so it is the position of the Homeschooling Association of Trinidad and Tobago that homeschooling may be described as the educating of children, primarily by their parents or legal guardians at home, instead of delegating this responsibility to other persons and/or educational institutions. Parents and legal guardians may utilize the assistance of tutors, but remain actively involved in the teaching and learning process. And so one of the challenges where homeschooling is concerned is a lack of understanding of what homeschooling is by maybe the average citizen or even the authorities. And so homeschooling is very different from the emergency remote teaching that is currently taking place. And so both Dr. Abdul, Majid, and the president of Tutor spoke about the complexities of the terminologies in terms of what is taking place now. And so when the government of Trinidad and Tobago declared that parents and teachers should engage in homeschooling, they were really urging persons to engage in pandemic schooling or emergency remote teaching that was taking place owing to the lockdown because of the pandemic, but that is not what homeschooling is. And so that is one of the first differentiations that I need to make. A few features of homeschooling, because to understand how homeschooling fits into this entire discourse, we need to have an idea of what it is, and because this demographic is an important stakeholder in education. And so there are numerous reasons why parents homeschool, right? So the first thing is that homeschooling is a choice. It is not an emergency situation that you're thrust into, which is what happened with the pandemic. So parents will homeschool for those parents who may have children who have special needs, and they feel as though after having their children in the system for a little while, nothing is happening. They're not able to get an aid, and their children, their needs are not being met. And so they take their children out of school and they do what is necessary. They pay for assessments, for psychologists, for programs, and for support, and they work with their children. Some parents do it because they would like to give their children a more holistic experience of education. They want to allow children to have a more interest-led experience of education. And so as we go along, you will see some more of these reasons in the presentation. So what you find is that many parents who homeschool usually choose or already have a philosophy of education and outcomes upon which to base the education of their children. Parents then choose curricula, times, and methods of delivery based on the outcomes that they would like to achieve. And so you find that they would not always stringently follow the traditional format as laid out in the public or private school systems. Parents often employ real-life circumstances to teach their children. And so some examples of homeschooling philosophies would include whole child education or holistic education, unschooling, world schooling, interest-led education, a literary or literature approach to education, a classical approach to education, a Charlotte Mason approach to learning, which is more hands-on, or Montessori education, which has been extensively adapted to homeschooling families as well. And I think if I were to say one of the ways that we can consider charting progressive agendas in education would be for our formal system to begin to engage in some of these theories and philosophies to see what can be adapted to how we do things to allow for some of the flexibility that has been mentioned in the presentations thus far. Another challenge, I think, is that our local narrative still seems to broad brush or paint parents with a broad brush. And so sometimes little faith is placed in parents as equal partners in education. Yet from as early as the mid-1990s, more and more research has been showing that parental involvement in children's education has positively impacted academic performance, right? And so I won't go through all of this, but I just want to leave that as one important point. And I mean, a lot of educators know that that is what the research is saying. Now, research originating outside of the region that started to also look at homeschool children and performance is also suggesting that homeschoolers, meaning the children who participated in the research studies, did not show deficiencies in education where their achievement scores were concerned. Many homeschoolers performed very well in reading and writing. In the US in particular, homeschool boys tended to outperform their public school peers. Many homeschoolers went on to tertiary level education after being homeschooled. And that when the academic performance of homeschoolers was compared with their public school peers in the US and the UK, in terms of similar ethnic and income levels. So not trying to compare apples with oranges, okay? Not trying to compare the cream of the crop with the average, trying to compare in a systematic way that there was very little difference between the performance of homeschoolers and their equal peers in the public school system. Therefore, overall, whether it is in a public setting or homeschooling, we know that parental involvement in the education of children does have the potential to benefit children academically and socially. And Wilder 2014 conducted a meta-synthesis research showing that parental involvement is much more than just assistance in homework, but encompasses the hopes and expectations that parents have for their children and their willingness to work towards achieving these. So one cannot come to a positive conclusion from a negative premise. Therefore, a progressive approach to education during and after the COVID-19 pandemic in our context should include more concerted efforts to positively engage parents, especially those like homeschooling parents who are taking responsibility for the education of their children. And so it is this kind of collaborative, a more collaborative and data-driven approach needs to be the premise upon which, for instance, a homeschooling policy is based, as opposed to fear and the need to just control and regulate this demographic. I think proper policy cannot emerge out of fear and control. Understanding and collaboration is also extremely critical. And so while the pandemic was going on, as the person from the Homeschooling Association who feels calls from parents who are interested in homeschooling, but also having a handle on some of the families that already homeschool, I reached out to families in a couple of the support groups that the association has to see how the pandemic impacted them. And so 10 families were approached who were willing to share, 9 mothers and 1 homeschooling father, totaling about 25 children ages from 4.5 to 16.
2 more minutes.
Okay. And so what we saw is that homeschooling families were negatively impacted by the pandemic as well. A restriction on their movement to some of the places they were accustomed to going to. Children were sad because they missed their friends. They also missed their co-curricular activities, sports, music, playtime, etc. And so then what can we learn from the ways that homeschooling parents adapt to these situations? 1, flexibility. Homeschooling facilitates flexibility. And so because of this, some families or many families were able to slow down and even stop schoolwork for a period of time to allow the family to be flexible to some of the configurations brought in by COVID-19. Secondly, interest-driven learning is another very important aspect that we can take from homeschooling. Many children during this time initiated studies in their own areas of interest, such as art, reading, crafting, gardening, science, DIY projects, and parents allowed them to be able to do this. Focus on the well-being of the entire child. Many homeschooling parents talked about giving their children more breaks during teaching sessions, constantly checking in with their children to see how they were doing emotionally, and then finding ways that they could adjust how they taught or what they did to incorporate the mental well-being, physical well-being, and emotional well-being of their children. Hanif Benjamin, clinical therapist and traumatologist, I remember listening to a program he was conducting, and he said that insufficient attention has been paid to the trauma and disruption that children were experiencing during COVID-19, and he felt as though this needed to be a central part of the national education response to the pandemic. And so I would end by saying, lessons learned, or that can be learned from homeschooling. The response of homeschooling parents to educating their children during the pandemic were in line with what Benjamin espoused. Many homeschooling parents took a flexible approach to teaching and learning after the pandemic to help them adjust to the situation, and they continue to tailor what they were doing to meet the needs of their children. The sentiment that their children would be left behind and therefore being driven to complete a curriculum was not voiced by parents. They instead facilitated interest-driven learning in an even greater measure during the pandemic. And they also took a holistic approach to the needs of their children, factoring in the challenges ushered in by the pandemic. And so as a result, their strategies focused on the physical, emotional, psychological, as well as the academic well-being of their children. And so my final statement would be, it would be unrealistic to suggest that this level of attention can be replicated in a school system where every child is equally paid attention to. However, the progressive nature of this discussion, therefore, should also engage and even challenge policymakers to collaborate with and support homeschooling families, as this form of education can provide children with environments that allow them to thrive no matter the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajkumar. Surely COVID-19 has had many unintended consequences, and one of these has been to bring the whole notion of homeschooling to the fore as part of the discussion of educational options and outcomes. And I thank Dr. Rajkumar for giving us some perspective, data-driven perspective on homeschooling. I now want to invite Dr. Patricia Darden, also known simply as Dr. Pat, to make a presentation. She's an administrator, educator, and musician, an honors graduate of music from New York University, who also holds a master's and a doctorate in educational administration from Cleveland State University, and has also published several articles in various journals dealing with education. I now invite Dr. Pat to make a presentation, and let me remind you to please adhere to a 10-minute time limit. Thank you very much.
Good
Dr.
morning.
Pat?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for this amazing opportunity. All protocols observed. Sincerely appreciate this opportunity. So 10 minutes is not a long time at all. And I thank my colleagues for framing their whole discussion around COVID-19. So I want to share with you a presentation that has more photographs than words. So this is our school. Right now, it is quite emotionally desolate. There's no one in it. It is indeed empty. And I want to speak about holistic education, what it is. So we're looking at the social, spiritual, physical, emotional, creative, intellectual development of children and adults, their appreciation of life and their lifelong love of learning. So we are a private school, but with a very public agenda. We see ourselves preparing a blueprint for the schools of the nation. So when the Ministry of Education redesigned their curriculum in circa 2013, they looked at two things which we hold on to because they are in keeping with our holistic curriculum. Curriculum should be thematic and it should be integrated. So 2020, pre-pandemic, Holistic Schools and Zum Zum Museum presented Vendredi V 2020. We stream in mass. And this was almost a prophecy. We stream in mass. The stream actually stood for science, technology, research, engineering, economics, arts, and mathematics and maths, because we used maths as an opportunity to integrate and use maths as a theme. So there we have our New Age parakeets, we had the World Wide Web, we had solar panels growing food. Zoom Zoom is a children's museum run by my friend Sonia Dumas. So here we were, Vendredi V, February 14th, back of Queen's Hall with our preschoolers and early childhood children, our older ones, looking at the technology that would be required to stream mass, our New Age bats, our World Wide Web. And we actually went to the savannah for the first time. Our people, we played mass on that savannah stage. And it was indeed awesome. Then, March 13th, 2020, impact of COVID, existential anguish, isolation, universal grief, economic instability, prolonged uncertainty. So for private schools, this is a huge thing. Economic instability. We have no government to pay our teachers. We have mortgages. We have rental agreements, the new ones. The older ones have maybe second mortgages for maintenance. And of course, the prolonged uncertainty. We're coming out. We're not coming out. We're starting next term. No, we're starting next year. We don't know. So these are pandemic times. And here I am in Carnival 2021 playing mass by myself at Jackie Hingson's exhibition. And there it is, his mural that explains online school challenge. And there I am streaming mass. There's Shadow making a contribution. There is the COVID-19, and COVID-19 crushed our school systems. They absolutely crushed them. Lessons learned. We had to develop routines, and I'm speaking about education for private, but again, public agenda, the importance of routines, the importance of rituals, because at the end of the day, school is about people. It's always about people, and establishing boundaries. Teachers wanting to implode and explode because they had their children at home that they are teaching. They planned the lesson and the PowerPoint wouldn't work for whatever reason, yes, and crying themselves to sleep at night and still having to be there for their families and for their extended families, because that is what school is. We realize so much now the importance of minding children. That the role of schools in minding children really important. You have children at home supervising themselves. Future of education. So I have a short video. I'm going to stop sharing now.
You have two more minutes.
2 minutes. So I'm going to share my video. It's just about 2 minutes long.
So according to the dictionary, personification is the attribution of personal qualities, especially the representation of a thing or abstraction as a person or by the human form. Can anyone give me an example of personification in the poem? Is everyone paying attention? Is anyone paying attention? everyone. Let's talk about personification. Personification. Take a look at the poem and illustration on your screen. The clock tower glowers. Its hands fidget towards dawn. Is the clock tower acting like a person? Yes or no? Oh, Charlie seems to have the answer, but hold that thought. Let's get to your breakout rooms first. Act it out with your friends.
At Holistic, we don't teach subjects, we teach children, no matter where they are.
So I have come to the end of my presentation, and only to say the future of education is about engaging our children. Education, folks, is absolutely the new gold. And I just want to share with you this photograph of our new hybrid golden lantanas. Education is indeed our new goal. Oil and gas, move aside. It's about education now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Pat, and thanks for reminding us or highlighting the real challenges being experienced with online delivery and the need to be creative with our learning strategies. Thanks again. I now wish to invite Mr. Bobby Andrews, our last speaker. Mr. Andrews is the planning coordinator in the planning department of the Tobago House of Assembly. He has been involved in research relating to the performance of Tobago students at sea, gender and student achievement, as well as the implication of national tertiary education policy for Tobago. He's the holder of a Bachelor of Science degree in General Agriculture, as well as a Master of Science degree in Planning and Development, both from the University of the West Indies. I now invite Mr. Bobby Andrews to make his presentation. 10 minutes with a 2-minute warning. Mr. Andrews, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCree. I would like to at least indicate my pleasure, my distinct pleasure in being a part of this forum. I'm just trying to navigate the technology in a minute. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes. You could go into slideshow.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much. And to all the previous presenters, I listened with great delight. And I hope to do justice to this and to SALISES and their forum. And thank you all. I am presenting on resetting the education button. How do you integrate research spirituality into the culture of learning as part of this response? And let's go to the next slide. In the education system, as much as has been said before, there are some things that we need to take light of. There are perennial and residual concerns on educational effectiveness. We see some responses with respect to the review of pedagogy. One time we see continuous assessment is on the radar, next time it's not. There's also the broadening of student options, TechVoc, TVET, and so on. And even conversations with respect to the removal of the Concordat. And of course, we also have issues of gender and regional dichotomies in attainment. This also tells us that even before the issue of COVID-19, we have some serious issues that precipitated an umbrella situation of a policy uncertainty. And whenever there are these major policy shifts, you find that some subsections of the education sector respond better or more resilient and others not. Tobago is one of those. And of course, we know the issue of gender. Back in 2008, when I was looking at the impact of the SEA on overall attainment, we showed that boys' mean dropped right after, far more than girls, and then it sort of picked up afterwards. So the issue, which is mentioned by at least the last two speakers, is how do we engineer resilience in the education system? It's not just from the pandemic or what is to come, but in the actual existence as we speak, we are not really using what I would say the clear research foundations for the policy. We seem to be more addressing symptoms rather than causes. And what is necessary is for us to integrate mixed research methods to distill root cause, because in planning, root cause analysis tells us that the solution to the problem is the mirror image of its root cause. And in order to line these two up, we need to get to the part of doing that. And we would definitely need to do a mixture of some groundbreaking and incremental steps in order to get to it. I'm going to gloss over this one. Economic dichotomy and uncertainty, this was also mentioned. These are the issues that drive these vulnerabilities, poverty and inequality, functional literacy. All of these were mentioned before. Environmental vulnerability, social trauma and the children's authority. Not just that. I think that same interview with Mr. Benjamin, he indicated that over the 900 plus cases of social trauma against children, 80% were perpetrated by persons who are either family members or known to the family. And that's another concern. You have social decay and the decline in the extended family. You have crime, criminality, drugs, and the desensitization of the society to many things. And our response even to the pandemic also is reflecting in some quarters some level of desensitization. And so that also impairs our resilience and our ability to respond. And of course, you have cultural imperialism, globalism, and one of its offshoots, which is peer orientation. So I'm going to go into these mixed methods areas that I am making some recommendations as to what we need to bring into this pool, this pot that we must be able to integrate to help the education sector respond. Maternal health. We have consistently high levels, and I consider them high, of teen births, persons up to about between 15 and 18% of all pregnancies or all live births, teen mothers. Teen mothers, obviously, who should be in the school system, of course, but of course, a higher incidence of low birth weight infants and a higher incidence of adverse pregnancy. You have also a high incidence, roughly around 10% of all pregnancies presenting at some point in time with low levels of blood iron and deficiency anemia. We know the correlation between the anemia and brain development. We have low uptake of exclusive breastfeeding, influenced also by part of our policies on maternity. But the lowest proportion of exclusive breastfeeding is the actual recommended amount, which is 6 months, followed by 2 to 5 months. And the highest number of persons who feed exclusively is 1 month. And of course, we have unsafe, and I put aborted abortions. And of course, we can't pin all of this on women because we have to deal with the issue of paternal health. And in view of an umbrella policy of decriminalization and a job subculture, zesters and farm parties, and the search for the high grade, persistent exposure to drugs does impact negatively on not just fertility, but sperm motility and health. And so Marjorie Newman Williams coined this term in the book Poverty, Empowerment, and Social Development in the Caribbean in its preface, edited by Professor Norman Govan. She says, Each year across the Caribbean, an unacceptably high number of children fail or do poorly in the 11 plus. But she goes on to say that these things could have been predicted because during these children's earliest years, they did not have the quality access to care and stimulation needed to prepare them for school.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. All right, so we have spirituality and education, to which I would have to bring in Aristotle. Education, he says, the root of it is bitter and the fruit is sweet. But if the real test for development is peace and the purpose of education is action, then really and truly, educating the child is nurturing the spirit in that child. And it does not take out the role of spirituality in education. And that also goes on to the spiritual role of the teacher. In James 3, verses 1 to 2, it says, "Not many of you, my brothers, should become teachers, for those of us who teach will be judged by greater strictness." But it also says that in Luke 6, 39-40, it says, "Can the blind lead the blind? No, won't they not fall in a ditch?" And it says, "The disciple is not above the teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like the teacher." There are other issues that we need to integrate. The issue of emergent learning, integrative learning, adaptive learning, and attachment learning. These are the elements of psychology that we need to bring into our education discussion. We tend to focus mostly on attachment learning, but there are other elements that we need to do, and we have to go beyond Gardner's, Howard Gardner, and the issue of intrinsic and extrinsic learners. There's also the issue of the socialization processes, where children would go through the phase of attachment, followed by the phase of individuation and the phase of socialization. In the current peer-oriented environment, the individuation stage of children are being couched in by forced socialization. Ultimately, there are issues of educational conditions, just to bring things up. But one of the things I said earlier is that the expansion of provisions at the secondary level to increase attainment doesn't really work. The data shows that if students fail English and math, only 3.8% of the females and 2.3% of the males would go on to pass all the elective subjects.
Please wrap up.
If they pass only one, thank you. If they only pass one, you have a 10-fold increase to 35% in males and 36% in females. And if they pass both, it would go up to 83 and 86%. So basically what we're saying is that the real problem with attainment, especially with boys, is that more boys fail English and math. But literacy and numeracy is in fact the key. So in terms of resetting the button, I would like to go down to the reset pathways. We need to change relationships between children and what I would call the attachment village, which is a group of responsible adults. Parental redirection on their own interest in education, which is talk about the revival of adult education. Because
please wrap up.
Yes, I am. This is my last slide. We talk about early exposure to the second language, exploring music and math connections, that we call the Mozart effect in the preschool system, exploring zoning, creating a shift on the premium of family time and the importance that families would place on culturing children to educational attainment and learning. And of course, student involvement in education, and of course, child and maternal health. So these are the areas I feel that become a cluster of areas of focus that we need to be able to push in order to create and engineer this resilience in the education system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. And with the limited time we have, my apologies for hurrying you up, so to speak, but thanks for a discussion that was broad in its nature, covering a range of important issues that of course predated COVID, and which COVID may have exacerbated issues relating to the vulnerability of our children, reproductive health, spirituality, even more technical issues relating to the type of learners and the type of learning and the relationship with the type of socialization that our children undergo and its impact on approaches to learning and teaching. So thank you for that broad discussion. I would now like to move to the question and comment session. I would ask all persons who would like to make comments or ask questions to be as brief as possible. I would ask the panelists as well to be as brief as possible in their response. We already have some comments from the chat, and I would try to give you a batch of comments or questions and ask you to respond accordingly. So I want to start with a question from Chelsea, which is very, I won't say unfair, but it would point to the problems with policy making and these type of activities. How will the recommendations suggested be utilized to inform policy decisions, particularly for early childhood? How will the recommendations suggested be utilized to inform decisions, particularly for early childhood? Second question, the school/education system has been recognized as an avenue to allow children to move out of their environment. Homeschooling works for families with resources. Homeschooling works for families with resources. How should education planners balance these initiatives? Third question, why have we settled, coming from Nigel Gittins, why have we settled for a system that consistently accepts a 40% failure rate, allowing for an annual dropout of almost 8,000 young people? Why have we continuously accepted this education apartheid, where there is the clear demarcation of prestige schools populated mostly by young persons of the privileged class, and other schools mostly for the poorer classes? And there's this annual convulsion of parents and pupils fighting to attain entrance into these prestige facilities. Hasn't this created enough mental anguish and health issues amongst our youth, probably scaring many of them for life psychologically? Why do we really need or create schools? Why do we not really attempt to create schools, that are all prestigious? Why do we not really attempt to create schools that are all prestigious or prestigious? That's a lot there to think about. So I would open up the floor now to the panelists to respond to any 3 or 4 of these comments or questions.
Mr. Chair, can I take the first swipe, please?
Sure.
In terms of the first question about the recommendations, especially recommendations with respect to ECCE, reaching to the policymakers, that is one of the approaches Tutor has been taking for a number of years, indicating as a recognized majority union for educators in the public sector that if you are considering as a state having particular vision agendas achieved, if you are considering having a seamless education system, then you must in the first instance ensure that all educators and the necessary education support staff are within the Education Act. We have proposed on more than one occasion suggestions for amendment to the Education Act so that the ECCE teachers, ECCE educators would be brought onto the schedule. To date, that has not been addressed. It has simply been met with a matter of condescension, even though there is the assignment of the junior minister to look at the ECCE matters. So policy matters would usually be raised by the university in the first instance and by the RMU in the second instance. As to the issue of the divide between students as caused by the Concordat, because that's the real cause of it, it has a lot to do with the politicizing of education in this country, colleagues, and the fact that we want to look at the influence and maintain a particular status quo within our education sector. So resource allocation is challenged. Teacher training is challenged. Teacher allocation is challenged simply because we want to maintain status quo, as I said, and because we want to consider that kind of societal divide. Are we really serious about equity in education? Tutor has said repeatedly, we don't think so. And we have suggested some of the ways that need to change, including a review of that practice and that agreement that's called the Concordat, to make it more inclusive and to cater for the new realities and the diversities of the education sector. So I'll pause here. Thank you very much for allowing me.
Thank you very much. Any more responses? Dr. Rajkumar, it is stated homeschooling works for families with resources. Can you respond to that statement?
Thank you, Dr. McCree. Well, firstly,
yes.
I would want to just, Ms. Tika De Freitas also spoke about policy recommendations, right? And so I think that that is really important as well. In the Draft Education Act, previous administration made direct comments about involving the Homeschooling Association in the creation of a homeschooling policy to ensure that stakeholders are included. And so I think this whole need for collaboration, I don't think it is a strong point in the way that we build policy. Serious collaboration with stakeholders really needs to be considered for education to move forward, right? Because stakeholders have an idea what they want. And so policy cannot just be created and then trust upon stakeholders. Stakeholders need to be a very integral part of the creation of policy. And so I think that that is a really important point. We will not move forward if we do not change our paradigm where involvement and collaboration is concerned and give much more to than lip service, right? In terms of homeschooling families have resources. And so I know that there is a perception that homeschooling families are very well off because, there are those who think that, you have to probably live on one income and so for that to happen, whoever's making that income makes a lot of money. What you find is that in the context, the wider, global context, you're seeing more and more families who would be considered average or middling income families trying to become involved in homeschooling, making shifts, making adjustments, precisely because they may want to do some of what would have been said today. Either they want to really give a more holistic approach to education, or they want to give a more moral and spiritual approach to education. And so what you find in our context, yes, you do have middle income families, averagely educated families involved in homeschooling. But we've also found from the association's perspective that more and more single parents who work, grandparents, and now a diverse range of persons are becoming much more interested in homeschooling now because they strongly feel as though the education system is not working for their children. Okay. And so what is happening, and it's not, how do I put this? You're not looking at people who are renegades. I have found I am not a renegade, right? I came through our very traditional system up to PhD at UE. But I would say from my own personal experience, I enjoyed my educational experience. But I can see as a historian, I can analyze myself and I can see the clear gaps in my own education. And some of those gaps I did not want for my own children in terms of that integration between the practical and the theoretical. The love for areas such as history and literature and music and sport, those kinds of things, which we still have not found ways to meaningfully integrate into our system. And so that's why I really appreciated Dr. Pat's presentation, because this is some of what homeschooling families are trying to do. And so you find then that what is happening is that there's a little bit of a shift in terms of as parents are working with their children, and some parents who have worked with their children during the pandemic, who would have shared that, you know, they've always considered homeschooling, but the pandemic really brought to the forefront that their involvement in their children's education and working with their children, especially in areas where some schools were not able to really deal well with the pandemic and left many parents on their own. These parents took up the mantle, but what happened is that they began listening to their children, and they began to see responses that they themselves did not expect in terms of how their children responded, how well they were doing, how enthusiastic they became about learning. And so the association put out some videos on YouTube, where we have our contact number and our website, and parents began contacting us to see, well, how could we support them? What can be done? Because they really wanted to take up the challenge to work with their children. And I do not see this as something that is negative. I think it is all part of the progress of education. We want this embodiment of that true tripartite agreement, where we have parents and teachers and children working together.
Okay, thank you very much. I recognize Dr. Pat.
Thank
Dr. Pat,
you.
yes?
Thank you. Dr. Rajkumar, did I get the name correct?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, wow. You said it. When people look at private schools, they often think that private schools have a lot of money, but that is not the case for most private schools. Private school owners go into education because of a passion, because of a need. I lived abroad for 13 years, came back home and looked at our education system and said, how can I help? I started with the music school 2002 and 2005, started a preschool, only supposed to have 20 children. I only bought 20 chairs. But the more we taught in a holistic way, the more parents reached out to us to say this is something we needed. The issue for us would be the economic decline of Trinidad and Tobago. In those early days, we had civil servants, we had a mix of parents who made their children's education priority, put that money aside, did not go on vacations, did not have the newest cars, did not have the biggest homes. And as time went on, parents had to take their children out because of economic instability. Even now, we started the pandemic with 120 students. We are down to the 70s because parents, although they want it, they cannot afford it. And we cannot afford to give it free because we have a mortgage to pay and teachers to pay. So this conversation requires collaboration. This is a beginning of a conversation in terms of how we could work together. Those prestige schools run by boards, it's because the Presbyterian Church, the Catholic Church, those are the people in the beginning who had the money to start schools. So when the government went to them, they had to kind of like buy places in the schools almost, right? So 80% for your people, 20% for us. We need excellent secondary schools throughout, not just for, a few passionate about it. I know time, but definitely we need to discuss this, folks. I am here to support.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pat. Now, I want to provide another batch of comments, questions. I would ask the panelists, it's a terrible request. You want to be as detailed as possible, but to be also as succinct as possible. So if you could negotiate that dichotomy, much appreciated. We will be able to have a broader discussion. So I want to begin the next batch of questions with two questions from Newsday reporter, Miss Rihanna McKenzie. And the first question, The Minister of Education has indicated if all goes well, lower form students in secondary school can return to the physical classroom. What are the concerns for teachers, parents about the idea of a full reopening with forms 1 to 3 students possibly returning to schools in January? Let me repeat. What are the concerns for teachers and parents about the idea of a full reopening with forms 1 to 3 students possibly returning to school in January? Secondly, for Dr. Abdul Majid, can you speak to the productivity and progress of learning for ECCE schools, students, in the virtual environment? Can you speak to the productivity and progress of learning for EC students in the virtual environment? Some teachers are complaining children are far behind in their educational advancement in the virtual platform. What methods can teachers adopt to improve the gaps in EC education in the virtual environment? For instance, development of fine and gross motor skills development. How are these areas being addressed? A next question comes from a colleague, Dr. Bipaya Pare. Mental health issues were highlighted by many of the panelists. How can the education system be reformed to ensure that these issues are minimized or treated with? Thirdly, or fourthly, I would like to know if there are any specific plans that private educational institutions can put in place to ensure financial stability for teachers in the event of a future situation like that of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I invite the floor now to respond.
Mr. Chair, maybe I should jump out again, and that would create a comfort.
Okay, fine.
The question from Rihanna in terms of the Minister's Code. Do you as a parent, do you as a citizen feel comfortable hearing, if all goes well, we will have students return to school? Does that signal to you, does that signal to us that there is a systematic plan, that there are measures in place to ensure health and safety, which we are concerned about? And so we cannot simply say, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's business as usual. How do we measure if all goes well when we look at what's happening with students of 4, 5, and 6 now and their teachers, and the fact that we have this closure ever so often at different schools? There must be, as other persons have mentioned, other panelists have mentioned, that kind of coming together of minds to plan for the reopening, because the contingencies that we fail to put in place now will definitely be required when you have more students in schools. Our schools were not built on our public schools were not built and designed for social distancing, and therefore the capacities would be limited. The resources in terms of human beings to sanitize, to supervise, etc., those are limited. And of course, the all-important issue of having the technical capacity, the technological capacity within our schools to facilitate effectiveness in curriculum delivery. So for me, as an educator, and for many of us as parents, if all goes well, does not build confidence or inspire confidence that our system would be ready to accommodate the students. We have recommended that you must look at phasing in of that. We have recommended looking at the health and safety considerations that must be in place, as well as I mentioned earlier, the kind of adjustments that would be required for curriculum delivery at the different levels, and by extension, the kind of assessments we would want to go into at the different levels. I'll pause here. I see Mr. Andrews wants to contribute as well.
Mr. Andrews?
Thank you very much. It's very important for us to understand that, as I said, root cause analysis. The concept of herd immunity is not just a country concept or a population concept. it has its layers. So if there isn't herd immunity at the level of the school institution, then the school institution would remain at risk for an outbreak or for a negative impact. So the concept of herd immunity has to be seen as a health issue, but is the concept of national herd immunity, but regional herd immunity, community herd immunity, and household herd immunity. The problem is parents are still hesitant, many of them, and they are refusing to also vaccinate their children. The children cannot give consent, so the real issue is getting to the parents who are hesitant for one reason or the other. If we do not have household herd immunity, it becomes difficult to herd children in a school with a mix of vaccinated and unvaccinated and hoping for the best. The last time we did that, when we had only standard 5s coming in so that they could get face-to-face learning ahead of the SEA, in 2 weeks, 11 schools were closed and then we had to scrap it. Nothing would be different this time. So I have no confidence because we are not dealing with the cause. We are dealing with the symptom and anxiety perhaps about this continued situation of students being away from the classroom and so on. But the real issue is vaccination and the herd immunity concept. And I want to say that in the context of herd immunity is not the be all and end all. Herd immunity is the pass mark. As with every social policy initiative, the real goal is universal access. Just as you have universal preschool, universal education for all, universal healthcare, the vaccination, because it is based on the human right to life, is really something that we should be thinking about moving to universal. So we get caught up with the labels, and the labels have persons trying to navigate from them. Okay, it started off elderly people, but I'm not elderly. Persons with comorbidities, I have no comorbidities. Persons who are immunocompromised, that's not me. So there's a NIMBYism where people try to get out of the label, but the real issue is something of a human right to life and access.
Thank you.
As everything else, we should be treating with what is the cause. And if we could deal with that, then we could deal with the other things. That's my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Dr. Abdul Majid, you want to respond to Ms. Mackenzie's question?
Yes, I would like to. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Mackenzie. One way we really need to find out what is the productivity and progress level of learning across the island. And to do that, we really need research. We have some small scale research, but we need some large scale research as well. What I can say is that teachers are doing their best. But even so, as you know, I might be repeating myself, but they need support. If you look at, there's a researcher who has an ecological systems model, that is Bronfenbrenner's model, and the child is at the center of that model. It's a series of concentric circles in a diagram, and you have the child in the center, and you know, you have the parents and the school and so on. Those are closest to the child, and they provide support for the child and the child's learning. Then beyond that, you have the community, and you saw the circles go further and further out until you get to the government level at the macro level. And what we have right now is a lot of what is happening in terms of teachers being upskilled, which is what they need, okay, and teacher support is coming from the micro level. Teachers are doing it for themselves. The schools are doing it for themselves. We don't have, you know, government intervention in terms of providing these types of support. And this is what we need. You know, we need support from further out in the circle to help what is going on at the center. So yes, we do have some teachers who are doing fine things with, like you said, gross and fine motor skills. They go online and they research activities and so on. And there are ways of teaching in a virtual environment that can simulate the face-to-face environment. But basic concepts of how children learn such as they need to be actively engaged. And that's what Dr. Pat presented, where she showed these children bored. And it's the same thing for young children, even more so. And when you actively engage them in learning, they become interested. So it's not passive learning. The principles of learning must remain. We need research and we need help from the government level. And there are models out there, there are models out there which we can adapt because we don't have a lot of money. We are developing state. But we are creative people. We could put think tanks together and we could come up with new and innovative ways for how we can do things. So that's what I can say.
Thank you very much. There were also questions relating to the financial stability of teachers in private educational institutions, as well as mental stability, the mental health issues that are currently being experienced. How can we deal with those issues at a more fundamental policy level and systemic level? Any responses to those two concerns?
Can I say something?
Yes, 1 minute, please. We are running out of time now. Yes, sure.
Okay, right. I'm not an expert on mental health issues and so on, because I was speaking to stress when I did my presentation, what teachers said. Okay, but definitely there's a help desk that could be provided, that could provide support for teachers, and we have community resources and so on. We could tap into all of those and we can assist teachers. Yeah.
Okay, I would take a few more questions from the chat from Dr. Denise Gaspard Richards. What is needed now substantively to ensure that the education system is moving towards resilience and facilitating continuity of learning in the coming years post-COVID? And to deal with matters of equity, access, technological readiness, artificial intelligence, what can be done now? There are also two questions from Lionel Remy. What particular competencies are required to facilitate homeschooling? And how do you manage peer social interaction needs of children at different age levels in the homeschooling model? And another earlier question on homeschooling, what data do we have on the number of families that are using homeschooling locally? Can you give quick responses to these issues?
Okay, so I'll just make a few quick comments on homeschooling, right? In terms of an earlier comment was made on homeschooling and privilege, and I find it's an interesting comment because right now the Homeschooling Association is attempting to engage with the Ministry of Education on the formation of a homeschooling policy, and so far the ideologies are more of control and regulation as opposed to attempting to understand what homeschooling is. And so we are finding it difficult to really have a voice where that policy is concerned. And so it's ironic if the general public may perceive it as something of privilege, and therefore it's something that we should be entitled to, when it may not be perceived. It may be perceived as something different on the other end by authorities in terms of this needs something to be clamped down upon. And so we have some challenges there in terms of perceptions, right? In terms of competencies to homeschool, interestingly enough, the research coming out of the US and the UK is showing that where specialization is concerned, having degrees in education and all of that, parents who homeschool, they do not need the same kinds of qualifications as teachers, trained teachers in the system. One, because there are a number of homeschooling curricula created with parents as teachers in mind. And so I've been exposed to some of those curriculum, I've used some of those curriculum, and I've reviewed some of those curricula. And some of these curricula we can also learn a lot about in terms of thematic approaches, integrative approaches to education, holistic approaches to education, right? And so homeschooling curricula, we encourage parents, if they can, to use it. What I've found is that there are a few approaches to textbook creation in our context as well that is going that way. It's more integrative. It is becoming more parent friendly. And so when I speak to parents who say, well, we can't afford to purchase a homeschooling curriculum, I show them how to integrate the local, what we have here locally, with free online resources that are set up to support homeschooling families, because that's what we do as the association. We are there to help educate parents and the public in terms of how you can homeschool effectively, right? And so that's one. In terms of different levels of peer learning, again, homeschooling curricula, it's different. You find that many curricula created with that in mind, knowing that it's families teaching. It's not a school system. And so they create multi-level curricula for parents. So you can have an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old or 13-year-old learning the same topic. So you have the same basic information, but you have different assessments for the children to use. And so as the parent, you're able to monitor the learning of your children on different levels effectively. And so it's just a very interesting and fascinating topic, both from a research perspective, but also from a personal perspective, and that we need to have more dialogue on so that the public can understand what homeschooling can do for nation building. And finally, in terms of data, the Homeschooling Association has its, of course, membership, right? So we would have logs of people who are families who are members. And so we have probably almost 200 families that are formal members of the association who would have registered with the association. As the pandemic has happened, you have more and more persons who are calling in, who are interested in becoming part of the association. And the association is actually a voluntary organization. And so what we realize as well is that there's a need to encourage people who are members to become more, it's less than, okay, what can the board of the association do for you? Which is sometimes a symptom that we have in our country. What can you do for me? As opposed to how can we work together to fulfill certain kinds of goals? So again, the whole perspective of collaboration needs to be done. And the final comment on mental issues, mental health. I think we will be able to treat more effectively with mental health issues if we are serious about educating the whole child. Right now, I think our education system is focused on completing curriculum at different levels and assessing to make sure curriculum is completed. We have to admit that. I have been a teacher I'm young, but I've been a teacher for like almost 25 years. That's what we do. You need to finish the curriculum, you need to pass the assessment, and that's how we measure achievement. We need to move beyond that, because if that continues to be our underlying philosophy, we will get nowhere where things like mental health issues are concerned.
Dr. Rajkumar, since you're on the floor, I wish to share a comment from, I believe, our principal, Professor Brian Copeland, and who makes reference to the Indonesian national education system using a particular homeschooling model. And he is commenting that seems to be a good reference point, and it also includes the non-formal sector of education. Are you familiar with that model? Can you comment on it?
No, that is something I can't comment on Indonesia, but it's something I definitely would want to look at. I mean, there's a lot of talk about what is happening in some of these Scandinavian countries in terms of their public system, Norway, Sweden, these countries. One of the things I started to look at was going backwards, because a lot of times we look at now, but as a historian, I went back to see, well, what would have caused the shift in the paradigm where the education system was concerned. Somebody spoke about special needs. Educators came to a point where they realized that our education system is not working for us, and it is going to take a while to fix or to adjust. And I think we need to come to that point. We have to stop the piecemeal changes. Change is something, if we want long-term change, is going to take a while. It's going to take more than 1 5-year policy, 2 5-year policies. And so what we are seeing now in some of these countries would be changes that are 3 and 4 decades in the making. And we need to begin visioning like that. We come together as not just the technocrats, but the persons who are the stakeholders. Where would we want to go? What would that look like? And not be afraid. We have too much fear. What would that look like? And then how can we realistically chart visionary in terms of strategically, how can we chart these courses? And then we begin. So in these systems, all teachers have special needs qualifications. So there's no issue about children being left behind, because teachers, they see teaching as special needs children to integrate them into the system. Teachers need to have these kinds of qualifications. What do we need to do for teachers to become qualified? What do we need to do to encourage people to become genuine teachers? And it's not just I need to make some money. Teachers is a hustle. So we have a lot of things that we need to be honest about in our system to be able to move forward in terms of our pedagogical approach, our philosophical approach to education, so that we can really move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Rajkumar. I am responding to the chat. I did say there's a time limit on panelists to respond, but I'm responding to the chat and the concerns and questions asked. There's another question related to homeschooling that was previously asked. How many families locally are using homeschooling? The question that was asked by Terry and Brown Campbell is, what percentage of local students are homeschooled? And how easily are parents able to deal with the school-based assessment issues? Can you respond to that while you're on the floor?
Sure, no problem. Okay, so in terms of, again, locally, what we encourage parents to do would be to send a letter of intent to homeschool to the ministry. And so the ministry can begin to gather in terms of that, because in terms of the homeschooling membership, we will know how much we have as membership, right? A couple hundred families we have membership, and others who will continue to apply for application, right? But then, of course, this will not be the entire homeschooling population across Trinidad and Tobago. So having allowing parents to state their intention to homeschool and have that logged in a database is important, so we can have a better idea of the numbers of parents that homeschool, right? What was the other thing you asked me? I think it was really important.
How many local students are making use of homeschooling locally? Or put differently, how many families are using homeschooling as an education strategy? Do you have data?
Right, as I said, so we have data for the association, right? And so for the association, we have our website allows us to log families and number of children. And so we have almost 200 families with upwards to a couple thousand children being homeschooled right now from the association's point of view, right? And with the pandemic, what is happening is that more and more parents are inquiring and exploring homeschooling as an option for their children.
Okay, thank you. Wrap-up time is near. There are 44 new messages in the chat. In the limited time we have, it's very difficult to engage all those messages, but I would like to ask Ms. Dr. Abdul Majid to again respond to another question from Rihanna McKenzie of the Newsday. Can you speak to the productivity and progress of learning for EC students in the virtual environment? Some teachers are complaining children are far behind in their educational advancements in the virtual platform. What methods can teachers adopt to improve the gaps in EC education in the virtual environment? Or did I ask that already? I think I asked that already. Sorry about that.
I did respond to that.
Okay, sorry. There's a question from Francine to Tutor. What is your problem with the Concordat? What is Tutor's problem with the Concordat?
Tutor as an entity, Mr. Chair, does not have a problem with the Concordat. The Concordat is a post-colonial arrangement between the Ministry of the Government of Trinidad and Tobago and the Catholic Board in the first instance and subsequent denominational boards to allow, as was said, access to students of the different groups. What we are having is that the discrepancies in terms of resource provision and resource allocation, and that stigma or that labeling creates certain perceptions in society that we have to get away from. As someone said earlier, all schools can become prestige schools. Tutor has posited that. However, there must be a change in mindset by all citizens that all schools become prestige schools and we do not label students based on what school they come from. Thank you. Mr. Chair, you are muted. I'm sorry. So we don't hear you.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. The special needs children, a question was asked earlier about how they are being dealt with in this particular scenario. The whole special needs sector.
One of the, well, I am answering, I don't know if I see two other hands up, but from tutors' perspective, the special needs schools have not been receiving the funding that they normally receive from the state, one, and so two, the children in the mainstream schools who have special needs, the officers of Student Support Services Division have been trying to reach out to them, but that's a very small unit, and so they've not been able to treat with all the students. And so we have students with special needs and in special needs schools who have not had their unique circumstances addressed. And we've spoken about that as well and made recommendations to the ministry on that too.
Yes, thank you. I recognize Mr. David. I'm sorry for keeping you, as well as Dr. Pat. Sorry. Mr. David?
Yes, good afternoon. I thank you very much for that. There's some things I just want to address here, as we pass along. I think one of the fundamental mistakes that we may be making in that our planning to move forward post-COVID is that we may feel that we feel that we are going back to our normal life, that life has not changed, everything is going to go back to normal. And I think that is one of the fundamental mistakes that we will make in terms of pushing forward if we continue with that mindset. So for example, pertaining to that question that was posted by the Newsday journalist in terms of the concerns lies, I agree with Ms. Freitas. There is a need for more serious dialogue between stakeholders with the Ministry of Education in terms of ideas and points moving forward. So for example, currently in certain schools, there's something called a hybrid learning system which is in place. Some students are in school, some students are at home, and both of them are being educated at the same time. Yes, the fundamental difference is the availability of technology. This is also where the government needs to come in and place a special emphasis into providing these sort of resources to our schools. We have discussed these things many, many, many times. All right. And due to COVID, it has just exacerbated the situation at hand. But going forward, these are some of the things that we need to look at, especially if it is that we're speaking about modifying or changing up this educational system. Because currently, the ministry themselves are looking at changing the educational system. With pertaining to my presentation, I spoke about the politicizing of the educational system. Every 5 years, some sort of change, massive change takes place. There's no growth within our educational system whereby we can establish we have grown from this point from A to Z, from A to B, and from B to C, whereby we are actually satisfying the needs or meeting the needs of our society. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. Sometimes we see courses just appear. Are these courses really satisfying the needs of our society? Are the people who are graduating from universities, from schools, those sort of things, are they satisfying the needs of the business sector, the manufacturing sector? These are the things that we need to look at. In addition to that, in reference to the mental health, right? So that's something I had raised as well too. We many times we fail to want to make a positive change in our educational system with the fear of making a mistake. It is time that we take that chance and leap forward and see what the future holds. So for example, the inclusion of extracurricular activities within the curriculum itself can assess in terms of our mental health. Also to the staffing of the counselors that are attached to the schools itself. This is something that we will need to look at. So for example, we have students studying in universities itself, seeing about counseling and those sort of things. Some sort of partnership should be developed whereby they have gathering some sort of experience on the field with the schools in terms of reducing the workload for many of these school counselors that exist currently. The Concord Act. I think we place too much emphasis on the Concord Act. I think our emphasis should really be made towards developing our educational system. seeing where the pitfalls are and trying to make improvements on that instead of constantly, because I've been in this PTA for many years and I've constantly hearing this Concord Act come up over and over again. Yes, they may pose some issues or whatever, but as Ms. DeFritter said, as indicated as well too, we need the government to place special emphasis on the resources of all our schools. This is something that we need to do, and even more so post-COVID, especially where we're dealing with viruses being spread within the school itself. We need maintenance, all these sort of things we need to look at. So I think that is much more than just having these discussions, but it's having a genuine concern and dedication to our educational system and actually seeing the educational system grow and move forward. Because again, we may have beautiful conversations and next year or next 5 years, we'll be back again having the same conversations again. All right.
Thank you, Mr. David. Dr. Pat, before you take the floor, just allow me to ask this question from the CNC3 News, Carissa Lee. I wish to recognize. She quotes from Mr. David's presentation, the impact of learning loss will be felt across all levels. This is as a result of the pandemic and the divide. I would like to ask stakeholders, how is this going to be addressed? How is this going to be rectified? You recognize it, so what now? Dr. Pat?
Thank you. I will try to be as brief as possible. So I just have a few short points. First of all, I am grateful to technology of 2020 because without Zoom, this would not be possible. Education would not be possible the way we do it in terms of engaging our children. 2, fine motor and gross motor skills. We recognize that all this sitting down during the pandemic is awful, not just for ECC, it's for everybody. I'm standing now in front of my computer because for the first year plus, I was sitting and my legs were beginning to feel like absolute mush. So at school, from ECCE to Standard 5, we are working on building their gross and fine motor skills. Handwriting, because when we come back out to school, it will no longer be keyboarding. My own handwriting falling apart. We all need to work on fine and gross motor skills. Mental health. Before you can teach children, it is important to build that community. They must want to turn on their computers every morning and say, good morning, Miss So-and-so, and I don't know what's happening at other schools, but at some schools I heard that students are not required to have their cameras on. That is so important for the engagement. We at Holistic have used almost 2 months to recalibrate our students. There's an elephant in the room. It is called a pandemic. Special needs growing because we have automatic promotion at some schools. They have no room in the system. So a child did not get standard 3 skills, no problem. Just move him on to standard 4, get him out of the system. Cannot work. And the last thing, SEA is so important because it promises free secondary school. That's the bottom line, the money right there. Even private school parents, they don't want to have to pay for 7 years of secondary school. So if it is free secondary school, well, let's improve it. Let's develop it. Let's ensure that everybody receives an excellent secondary school opportunity. That's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I understand we have 20 more minutes to continue this important discussion that confronts us all as it relates to the problems with which it deals. So are there any more responses from the panelists concerning any of the questions raised? And the last one in particular from CNC3 reporter, Ms. Carissa Lee, relating to a statement made by Mr. David, the impact of learning loss will be felt across all levels. Any more responses on how are we going to deal with that systematically in terms of public policy, in terms of issues of training, in terms of issues of technology?
Yeah, Yes, Dr. McCree, I will take this question at this point in time. One of the main things that we have to look at is avoiding the pitfall of solely looking at the primary school level as the catchment of failure, because that provides that avenue into a secondary school, so that we will more or less be focusing on the primary school level. However, the secondary school level also has to be addressed as well too. What about those students who are actually leaving the secondary school level? So programs will have to be set up and put in place. The main step in terms of that process has to be identifying where the pitfalls lie. So that is identifying exactly when school broke, when we went home, when that entire term, when nothing was done, the assessments, proper assessment, provided that proper assessments were done prior to that, and as well as to the ending of the opening of the second school term. These are the things that we need to analyze and look at. The data itself will be able to provide that sort of information. From there now, we'll be able to formulate now a guide now in terms of moving forward, in terms of teaching these students now. So there may be some things that we may have to, well, stand to be corrected here, leave out of the curriculum to ensure that proper development of the child is taking place at that point in time. And as I said before, this has to be done both at primary and secondary school level. It cannot be done at primary, because I know that there's a grand focus. We had the discussions yesterday, and the focus was mainly placed on primary school levels in one of the discussions that we had in a meeting, right? So that's primary and secondary as well as at tertiary, because all our discussions right now is around primary, secondary, ECC schooling and those sort of things. But what about the tertiary level? The tertiary level now is what prepares that next step in society, whereby which drives the manufacturing sector, the business sector. So these are the things that we need to clinically look at. But again, it goes back to the data. And if it is that we were really measuring correctly and collecting those data, and with the intention of actually analyzing, because many times we just collect data just for collecting data's sake and just having it there. So that is one of the first steps that we will have to take in terms of moving forward in that regard.
Anyone else? The chat, there's a sentiment in the chat that is calling for action. And Marilyn Bob is saying too much talk, not enough action. You know, and this is very problematic in a context where you cannot do much. So, but in a long-term sense, and I guess in a systematic and policy sense, you know, what can be done? What can this moment sensitize us to that we were not doing enough before to really deal with some of the problems?
Since I'm on the floor, Doctor, I'll just like
yes.
to share that
yes.
as well. I agree. I feel the same way in terms of the discussions, the meetings that we have. I think it's time that we have more stakeholders coming together and having discussions on a foundation that is provided by your entity at this point in time. We need more of that, greater ideas coming together and pushing forward towards the Ministry of Education. It could or should probably no longer be just a few of us sitting at a table and being ignored at times. I think that the greater society needs to come together, place the ideas in this pool, and we share this information and we push this up to the Ministry of Education. And from there, proper dialogue, proper conversation, proper research be done into these ideas. And piece by piece, we begin to integrate it within our educational system. We're not talking about a total implementation of our educational system overnight or within a year or anything like that. We're just talking about gradual changes, right? Subtle gradual changes with a vision in mind to guide and ensure that we are actually making improvements to the educational system. Because many times the changes that we make are just there to correct some sort of error, some sort of mistake. There may have been a fall in mathematics and in last year, so we may need to improve on the statistics. So we may try to implement something at that point in time. We need to look more long term and become more strategic in our planning in going forward.
Mr. David, to complement what you have said, let me share a comment from Marilyn Bob. as it relates to the process of change. She says a big persistent part of our problem is trying to address the problems of education with a single solution, which of course cannot work. Solving the complicated and interconnected problems require understanding of the complexity that we need, and that we need to stop putting a plaster on the sore rather than finding the source and addressing it with collaborative and comprehensive solutions. Shades of what Mr. Andrews is talking about, looking at the root. And there's also a comment coming from Fiona Rajkumar. I completely agree with you, Dr. Rob. There's no one single solution to the way that we need to move forward. We need to stop using plasters. We can also consider that we need to stop referring to sports, music, etc. as extracurricular activity. And another comment from colleague, Dr. Tayamba Salandi. I am perplexed by the idea of turning government schools into prestige schools. The intention here may be good, but I don't see prestige schools as necessarily having the model for the type of transformation needed in the education system, unquote. Any further responses to the issue of how we go forward, how we deal with the problems, what models of transformation we use, you know, and participation and that sort of thing. Any comments?
I would like to say something. I responded to Carissa Lee in the chat where I said that we have to advocate in areas where the support needed is not coming or understood from the top. You know, we have to form learning communities. We have started one at the UE among early childhood educators. We have a learning community, and it's amazing the ideas we can pull together when we sit down and chat and meet as a group and what we can come up with. So the planners, they cannot know the challenges on the ground. They cannot know all the challenges in the absence of research and so on. We need think tanks of stakeholders who can contribute valuable ideas and innovation. So we need to form these think tanks. And not token think tanks, but real people who are truly interested and can contribute. And there are international models that we can follow. Like I said, we are a small country. We don't have a lot of resources, but we can certainly use the ideas that are available out there. And teachers need to retool themselves. Unfortunately, at this time, it might be at their own expense or the school's expense. Okay, they need to learn how to use freely available resources and how to purchase and use. There's a change in mindset there. We actually have to purchase and use online resources as well.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Andrews. You had your hands up.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you for those and some other comments. One of the things that Mr. Remy said in a question much earlier, I think it was missed, looking at how do you navigate peer social interaction and its impact on learning. Well, briefly in my presentation, I spoke about the deleterious effect of peer orientation on the 4 strands of education in the realm of psychology, from emergent learning, integrative learning, adaptive learning, and attachment learning. And so what opportunity COVID-19 did is create an opportunity to break the ubiquitous presence of peers in the face of our children, and they have now been refocused around the family. And so therefore, what is really more important to help children focus on education, except their peers are the ones that also have that focus on education, is connection to persons who treat education as a priority. And once that emotional and attachment connection to someone who has that as a priority, it influences them. And in that context, the issue of the Concord and the prestige school become relevant. In the prestige schools, the students all have that interest in wanting to get forward in education. So peer orientation and the effect of it on learning is enhancing educational output. In the non-prestige schools, then it depends on attachment learning, on whether or not the teacher can have that influence, because the peers won't, because they would sort of shun the interest in education. The nerds and the geeks and so on would be the standouts. And so The real issue for me is where the curriculum and the concordat is concerned is, if you take 20% out of any population, you will have an impact. But the presence of the concordat didn't create the problem. Therefore, the absence of the concordat will not solve the problem.
Well said. Just allow me to share with you, the panel, some feedback again. This is coming from Professor Brian Copeland. Well said, Kevin David. The education system has to be developed to target clear graduate outcomes. Highest priority on the survival and growth needs of the nation. It must, of necessity, take into account all possible educational pathways, formal, informal, non-formal, the entire spectrum, unquote. And Marilyn Bob again, we have to change many attitudes and mindsets in the society in general, including in ourselves, before we could change all the ills of the education system and even develop an education system that supports our children and gives them a holistic, healthy development. Michael Clark, what the COVID-19 crisis has shown is that we need to have strategies to offer students a variety of techniques to access the same material. In one family I know, a boy with learning challenges has enjoyed the virtual school. His sister is not enjoying virtual classes. I go back to the panel for their own take on comments that have been made, on questions that have been asked that they previously did not get the time to answer or to engage.
I would like to make a comment quickly on something I didn't get to finish. And someone asked about rural areas needing focus. Tobago and Toku, perennially last or second to last in the assessment of the means by educational district in Trinidad and Tobago at the SCA every year. And the same is for rural areas. What we have to be able to do is translate that into targets of performance. The minister will go to the best performing school, but emphasis needs to be placed on the schools that need the attention in terms of improving the attainment. And there is a slide, which I didn't get to finish, which spoke specifically to that, where you can create different clusters, because whereas that is the case, in the case for Tobago, all the schools didn't perform below the national mean. We had 6 schools performing above the national means. We had about 5 performing about 3 points below the national mean. But there were other schools that performed as much as 33 points below the national mean. And I am sure the same thing was there. But the point I would want to make is that you will not be able to change the mean outcome unless all schools perform well. In other words, the Tobago schools that performed above the national mean needed to score even more. And also, those that performed below the national mean needed a wider range of a higher bar to come up to a particular level. So the tendency would be to think, well, perhaps, well, my school is not doing too badly, so it's okay. No. And that is the challenge. The challenge is, how do you translate the underperformance into measurable targets by educational district?
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Let me plug in here another question from Ms. Carissa Lee, CNC3 News. How bad is the learning loss situation in this country, would you guys say? Like, what are you guys bracing for as you begin to address this? How bad has been the learning loss nationally? Any takers?
Yeah.
Okay,
I would like
go
to
ahead.
add,
You go ahead.
very briefly, I was just on the floor. The CXC indicated that there was a high level of absenteeism, and we have the issue of opportunity cost and all the investment in education that went up to the point where absenteeism. But I must admit that we need to do a lot more research to look at the key areas where the output and the performance is concerned. But one indicator for sure that is never a good sign is when there's absenteeism, and absenteeism was at an all-time high in this year and reported, and not just for the O levels, but also for K. It doesn't augur well.
Any other responses? How bad has been the learning loss? How bad has been the impact on education process or system?
I just want to make a brief comment. Where homeschooling is concerned, this year there were some homeschoolers, some children who have been homeschooled for primary school, and some of them through primary school and secondary school, writing CSEC. Okay, not a large number yet, but it's in terms of my involvement in the association, and so being a homeschooler myself for about 13 years now, and being introduced to children at a particular age. So they were like between 3 and 6 at the time. And so now these children wrote CSEC this year. And so I think that, there's such a rich opportunity for research in terms of longitudinal studies following homeschooling families as well. And so what I've found with those, so on the association's board, those of us who make up the board, my children are the youngest. Many of the board members, their children are the ones who have written exams. And these children have done very well by national standards. They've all gained what we would call a full certificate and much more. So they haven't just gained basic certificates. They've all gained like 1s and 2s in math and English and their science and these other areas. Many of them are moving on to A-levels, and so they've secured spots in schools where they're doing A-levels, or they're moving on to tertiary level institutions like the University of the Southern Caribbean or UTT. They're already enrolled in these schools. And so I think this is really something we need to follow because many of these children would have spent the last couple of years going through COVID as well. During the pandemic, being in Form 4 and 5, right? And yet still being able to perform well. And some may say it is because purely of resources. I think it's much more than just the resources. Resources are important, yes, but I think it's also because of that flexibility we spoke about there, to be able to stop, assess what is happening, because it's not a whole system now, it's a family, that smaller ecosystem. Assess what is happening and what is necessary for us to be able to meet these goals, and then families are able to supply children with what they need to be successful. And so I think that it is something that we need to look at. We also need to look at, and these are my wrapping up comments, we really need to get back down to our basics. What are our ideologies about education and how we view what we want to accomplish with children? Do we really want to develop children? Because if we do, and we focus on their physical, spiritual, emotional, social and relational, financial, what we call wellness. If we look at education from a wellness perspective, we want well societies. COVID has ravaged us, not just economically, but in terms of health. We have a very high death rate. That worries me because we are too ill as a nation, right? And research is coming out on that as well. And not just in Trinidad and Tobago, across the Caribbean, right? We're too ill. And so if we focus on developing the whole child, and then we can contextualize the needs, our economic needs, and see how we can build our economy, then we may not chop out things that are important, like sports, like music, like history, because we just want to focus on meeting these. We have to have tech, science, and that's it. Forget everything else. But these other areas are important for our wellness. And so if we can have a construct, an educational construct that meaningfully encourages us to be well, and we begin to develop our policies based on, our attitudes towards the environment, right? A holistic approach to wellness, then we can really begin to see how we can chart chart some meaningful ways forward. Thank you.
Dr. Pat, you could also give your final comments, at the same time.
I wanted to address learning loss and say that we are not going to know about learning loss truly until our children come out to school. Right now, we have so many parents who are doing their children's work because they think they're helping them. So you give an assessment, even if it has to come back to school, if they upload it, you're seeing handwriting that clearly is not the child's handwriting. So when we come out to school, maybe the first thing would be for us to look at in-person assessments so that we can diagnose truly where the children are and recalibrate in order to move forward. For us, we tried something, I'm sharing this, we tried using Classic combined with Zoom so that as the children are working, you can see they're working in real time and they are there, each person with a separate online invigilator. Takes lots of resources, but I'm just throwing it out. Try it out, pilot it. Classic is free. Zoom is free for small, sessions. So that's it. Just as a wrap up, this is the beginning of a very important conversation. And I want to thank you and ask, how do we move forward? That's it from me. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Pat. Other closing comments from other panelists before I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Perry.
Yes. Hi. Dr. Pat, she hit it on the head. In terms of learning loss, that she took the words out of my mouth. That is clearly what has to happen, right? Evaluation after the fact. It can't take no other place, right? My closing comments really and truly is that I want to ask the question, where do we see ourselves as a people, as a nation, in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years? Where do we see ourselves? Where do we see our nation going, right? I think it's only then can we truly gauge or properly plan a vision or a way ahead. Those are my final comments. And thank you once again for the forum and the lovely discussion with the other stakeholders in education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And any other closing comments?
Just to close by saying Tutor is grateful for the opportunity to participate, and we look forward to the kind of interaction that will bring about the change in mindset and the change in thinking, the change in approaches that could take our education sector forward. Thank you for having us.
Dr. Abdul Majid.
Yes, I too thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel and to put forward the early childhood situation because it doesn't normally make news. And what I would like to say is learning loss, it would be different at different, it would have to be differentiated because it will be different at different levels, whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary, early childhood. It will be different in different sectors of the population and so on. So what we can look at is UNESCO data. There are studies done in which they have published in terms of learning loss across Latin America and the Caribbean. And some studies point to a very grim picture for our region in terms of, within the world. So we can look at some of those published studies and see where we stand generally in terms of learning loss. But thank you. We have a lot of work to do going forward. And I hope that, this session would continue, bringing forward good ideas, which will be translated into practice. Thank you.
Mr. Andrews?
Yes, thank you very much to UE SALISES and for the other panelists for their insights. It was a pleasure being here and sharing some of the information I would have been doing. It will not end here because I know we have to inject our expertise into the debate either on this platform or any other. So to you, Dr. McCree, and to Dr. St. Bernard and your entire group, I want to say thank you for the opportunity. I just want to just say that the whole philosophy, and a lot of persons have said it, that the whole philosophy of education just has to. George Giles says that whoever ceases to be a student was never a student. That should be one of the things we should consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andrews, and personally, I thank all of you. I want to end with a comment from Desmond Perry, who I don't know at all, in the chat. And he states, the way students learn must determine how teachers teach. Therefore, what's important is not what you do as a teacher, but what the learners do as a result of what you do. Hence, the ultimate test of teaching is not what you do or how well you do it, but what and how well the learner learns. But what and how well the learner does, And he ends by posing the question, is our education system really working, unquote. So I end on that note and hand over to my colleague, Dr. Bipaya Pare, to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure you all will agree that today's discussion on managing the education system was very enriching and profoundly thought-provoking. Of course, this forum would not have been possible without our panelists, Mr. Kevin David, Ms. Antonia Tika de Freitas, Dr. Savira Abdul Majid, Dr. Fiona Rajkumar, Dr. Patricia Darden, and Mr. Bobby Andrews. We are extremely grateful that you all took the time from your busy schedules to share with us today. Thank you to each of you for your contributions on the topic and your insights on how we can chart forward towards a progressive education system. I would secondly like to express heartfelt thanks to you, the audience, for your engagement in the discussion via your comments and your questions. You are an invaluable stakeholder in our virtual forums, and we thank you for your presence and continuous participation. All members of the audience are important, but I would like to acknowledge the presence of our campus principal, Professor Brian Copeland, in our audience. Thank you, Principal, for being with us and engaging with this important conversation. The professional and smooth running of the forum would not be possible without a number of persons. Special thanks to the Marketing and Communications Office for their steadfast support with our events. I would particularly like to highlight the contribution of Ms. Josanne Green, Ms. Chanel Glasgow, and Ms. Chelsea Sitahal. Thank you, ladies, and to the rest of the team for your efforts towards the profession's hosting of today's event. I would also like to extend warmest gratitude to the UE Campus IT Services for their technical support. Of course, thank you, Dr. McCree, for chairing today's event and for gracefully moderating the discussion segment. Of course, no easy task, but you did well. Thank you, Dr. McCree. There are lots of hands behind the scene, in particular those of various members of the administrative staff at SALISES. So I'd like to thank Ms. Katian Modest, Ms. Francine Alain, Mr. Ephraim Thompson, Mr. Leslie Brewster, and Mr. Sheldon Warner for their dedication and hard work in making today's forum a success. Thank you. I would also like to extend sincere thanks to the media houses who are present here today. You are also a valuable stakeholder in these forums, and we thank you for your engagement and your constant support. Thank you very much. And lastly, and by no means least, thanks to the Acting Director of the SALISES for his sterling leadership and foresight in the rollout of these forums and the creation of a space where issues important to the development of Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean region can be aired and discussed. So thank you, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, for the great work you're doing during your stewardship. Thank you again, everyone. I now pass you back to the chair for closing remarks.
Well, I hand over straight away to the Acting Director, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, to close off this very intriguing and important SALISES forum and to indicate whether there'll be a next one on the same subject. Dr. St. Bernard, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, my colleague, Dr. Roy McCree. And I am all smiles because I am convinced that this session, like the first inaugurals, SALISES virtual forum. I'm convinced that this session way surpassed my expectations. But first of all, like my colleague, Dr. Bipaya Pari, I would like to say how heartened I am to have witnessed the presence of the campus principal, Professor Brian Copeland, and his participation in today's event. I'm really heartened, and SALISES is really heartened, and it says a lot about the importance the management of the university has placed on this kind of event that SALISES has begun to champion. And this is just the second of these SALISES virtual forums that SALISES intends to convene on a monthly basis. So already I am thinking that by about the 3rd of December, we shall actually be convening a third forum. And based on how this forum went and from the sort of feedback I was getting from other colleagues at the time when we were preparing for this one, I'm convinced that the third forum will be an extension of today's discussion. So the third forum is really managing the national education system, the same sub-theme, part 2. And part 2, I've already identified a couple facilitators and presenters who can be part of that process. And I am thinking that we have to take a look at child rights. There will be someone speaking on the issue of child rights. We shall also have someone speaking on tertiary education, particularly from the standpoint of the educator's perspective. We are also looking at tertiary education, challenges with respect to the delivery of tertiary education from the standpoint of face-to-face versus online delivery of the curricula. I also have in mind, identifying someone who can look at, psychosocial issues and how they impact all of the various actors within the education system. And there are a few other areas that I am looking at. Of course, we can't touch on everything, but I'm going to try together with my colleagues and others who have shown an interest in the work we are doing to see how we can really pull this off by the 3rd of December. What I can surely tell you is that there is going to be no rest, because I started by saying that, in a SALISES forum we had recently, we were saying, there are those who go about saying that, hey, SALISES is the best kept secret. When we are done with you, SALISES will no longer be a secret. And as I said before, we will accept the notion of best, but best in terms of what we are expected to do in terms of the outreach that we engage in with our publics, whether in Trinidad and Tobago, regionally, internationally. We expect to be best there. And it's not just about being best, but it's also about bettering best. So we are about to better best in so many different ways. So as far as I'm concerned, we are on a roll. And SALISES has already been doing a lot in terms of the conferences, the annual conferences. In terms of the annual conferences that we host, we have hosted 22 of them. We have the 16th annual Child Research Conference that is going to be convened shortly. And these are organized by all of the different arms of SALISES, whether they be in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, or Barbados. We work as one team, we work as a regional team, and you can look out for staple events coming from the various branches of SALISES, and in particular, the SALISES that is based here in Trinidad and Tobago. So the 3rd of December, we are hoping to keep the ball rolling and one thing I can assure you as I think about, these SALISES fora or forums, whichever way you want to look at it, it reminds me of a panorama final, because every deliverable that you will experience, you can't say that one has been better than the other, because all of them are equally top-class performing, stellar performances, and each one is going to be a celebration of excellence as to what these kinds of discourses ought to be. And clearly, coming out of what happened today, I can tell you that there's a lot of talk out there about the science, and we are following the science. But the science is often a science about a microbe and how that microbe interacts with the human anatomy and physical and natural environments and that sort of interaction. There's a lot more about science than just those entities and those units. It's about human action, human behavior, human interaction in terms of issues pertaining to vaccination. And a lot of the discourses today spoke about the absence of data. Clearly, we cannot have a science without data. And data just does not happen like that. There's a cost associated with producing data. And we have also heard about all the economic challenges and the priorities with respect to expenditure and what that may mean for fostering research. So we have to get our priorities right if we want to talk about the science. If we want to talk about the science, we have to seriously take on board data collection and seriously take on board those who collect the data, because the action cannot take place if you do not have the research on the ground and the commitment to make the kind of expenditures to implement the actions that would bring about the kind of change that we are advocating in forums such as this one. So at this point, I really want to thank all who have made it a success. I am very heartened and eternally grateful to the 6 panelists who have presented today. I'm also eternally grateful to all of the virtual participants who have graced us with their presence, and all the folk who have worked behind the scenes, whether they be from SALISES or SITS or marketing and communication or elsewhere in the university system. We applaud you, and we are thankful for your contribution to the success that this event was. So at this point, I'd like to stop and wish everyone a wonderful rest of day, an enjoyable weekend, and we look forward to continued blessings. Just be safe and continue to practice all of the relevant protocols. Thank you very much.